So, a little bit of background information about me and the other panelists today. So, I teach in a few different places at Dartmouth College. I am in the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program, LALAX, which is an interdisciplinary program at the college. I also teach Spanish language classes. I also teach first-year writing classes. So, I'm in a few different areas. And my connection to Dartmouth Broadcasting is through my LATS 41, Latino Studies 41 class that I offer most every year. This spring, current term, I am teaching that class, and my students do programming because in this course, my students are learning about the history of different forms of mass media that are relevant to Latinos, Hispanic people in the United States. And radio, of course, is an important medium, as you all know. And the various people who have lived in this country, who have that heritage from a very early time period, recognize that in order to get their message out there, to share their music, to talk about their communities, radio was, of course, the medium of the early 20th century that was the predominant one from that part of the century up until the present day. And it's still very relevant for Latino communities in the United States. Many urban areas, especially various metropolitan areas, have a lot of radio stations that do programming either in Spanish or in English or bilingual versions of that. So we look into the history of Latinos in radio. And in order for my students to really appreciate what radio is and can be and its significance for our society, I have my students program a show. So I teach my course, and we have regular class meetings and talk about the history, the issues around this. We look at other media too. We look at cinema and television, as well as art forms. It's representations of and from Latinos in the media and the arts. And so my students on one time during the term, during the X hour, this extra time period we have in our classes, go down to the radio station in Robinson Hall. Almost all of them have never had experience with radio programming and been in a radio station. And I'll talk more about this later in more detail, but they really enjoy the experience, and the college is promoting experiential learning. So through the generosity of Dartmouth Broadcasting and WebDCR, right? WDCR now is, of course, internet-based. The students program shows, and the only requirement for the show is that they program music that can cover all sorts of genres, but something about, Latin American style music, Latino music, and again, they introduce it as a DJ does to give some information about the songs that they're playing. So that's my connection with Dartmouth Broadcasting. And I've been doing this now for quite a few years. I first taught the course in 2002. So as I say, not every year, but most every year I've been doing this. And Heath and other people involved at the station, the various students who work at the station, have been really generous in allowing my students to go down there and have this experience, this educational experience. So I am joined by a group of people who have had very direct experience with Dartmouth Broadcasting over the years, starting with Wallace Ford, class of 70. Wallace and I and Jeanette had a chance to chat last night about experiences. And then Shireen and Madison, we've been talking since this morning to get a bit of background information, but I'll share some information about the panelists. And of course, I think in the conversation that we'll be having, more information will come out. You'll hear more stories about their experiences here at Dartmouth College. But Wallace has worn a bunch of hats over the years. He's a class of 70, as I said. He went into law studies and practiced law in various places over the years. He was in the business world too, investment banking, and again, Wallace might share some of those stories. Currently, he's the chairman of the Department of Public Administration in the School of Business, Medgar Evers College at CUNY, at the City University of New York. So again, Wallace, a wealth of experiences, but dating back to undergraduate studies here at Dartmouth College when he was turning on this campus to Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone and rock music of all genres, all sorts of things. Again, Wallace will tell you some more stories about his time working at the radio station with WDCR. Shireen is next to Wallace. She's class of 2011. Currently, Shireen is in the Bay Area. She's been working with Facebook since she graduated. She's working on privacy-related issues with Facebook, so maybe that comes into the conversation today, right? Yeah, we'll hear more about it. I don't mean to pry. Important. And then Madison is class of 2012. She's currently a strategy consultant for Altman Villandry. She's in the tech, media, and telecom section of the organization. She's also in the Bay Area. She's also San Francisco based. So Madison and Shireen have come back to the East Coast to be here today to visit Dartmouth College, their school. And I think, Shireen, this is your first time back since you graduated, so trips down memory lane, no doubt. And then Jeanette Foster is our other panelist. She's class of 2014, as you can see. And she's been in the Washington area since she graduated. She's involved in education policy, working with the nationwide state policy and education organization that does get at issues of inclusivity and problems with exclusivity in schools. Jeanette is looking ahead to law studies at Columbia University. She'll be starting there in the fall. So an interesting group of people, I think you'll agree. And this panel really is a presentation. It's an opportunity for people to talk about the general theme of inclusivity and how Dartmouth Broadcasting plays into that. I've already told you a little bit about how the radio station has been wonderful for opening itself up to my students to have this experience of programming Latin music with a Latin tinge is the requirement for that class. The students always have a blast. As you all know, those of you who've been DJs, it's lots of fun. And it also gives them the opportunity to see how this medium is still relevant, is still important in our society. So we're just going to be, it's a free-form conversation. We're going to be telling stories about, as I say, the general theme of inclusivity, what people's experiences have been over the years. And of course, we're very looking much forward to having you all chime in and share, any comments you have and questions you might have for the panelists. And therefore, we will begin talking about how this general topic has affected our lives, right? And as I say, I've already shared a bit about, as a teacher here, as a professor at Dartmouth, how I feel it's been important for my students to have this opportunity. Because one of my goals with my class is that they gain this appreciation for radio itself and its power and its relevance still. And in the class, we talk a lot about music. If you're thinking about Hispanic people, Latinos in the United States, that's one way that music has had very significant influences over many decades, right? There's been, from the 1930s and 40s with Latin jazz coming into our society, and mambo and rumba and these different musical popular music that affected our society, on through the 1960s and 70s. Carlos Santana. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? I mean, all sorts of different Latino artists that have made an impact. And, we're very much connected with all of the Americas. This is something we talk about in our class, right? That the United States is a country in North America. But as we know, looking at the United States currently, Latinos and people of that heritage from Latin America are a significant portion of our population. And there's this cross-pollination of ideas that comes oftentimes through cultural issues like music and how music can influence and open up people's perspectives. So I would say from my perspective as a teacher here in the LALAX program, it's been a great opportunity for my students to understand how music can influence our society. And as I say, they have explored all sorts of genres in the radio programming they've done, from looking back to the early 20th century. This term, students have played Carmen Miranda and Desi Arnaz to just explore that history of, Latinos, right, Cuban and Brazilian musicians in the case of those two, and their influences in the United States, on to the present day with, all sorts of musical genres like ranchera music and corridas and hip-hop related music as well, right, reggaeton and whatnot. So it's been, as I say, a really great opportunity, a really wonderful resource to have Dartmouth Broadcasting open up its doors to these students. And as I said, it's now, web DCR, right? The way the students are sharing their musical explorations is through the internet, because of course we're not broadcasting on an AM frequency anymore out of Robinson Hall and out of the studios. But the students do their shows and their live webcasts out of the interface that is there in place at the radio station. And then a nice thing about the programs that the students do is that they're archived, they're captured, and they're available in effect as podcasts. So through my course and the course website that we have, all of our courses have a course website. The students can, if they don't listen live to their classmates, can listen later on to the students' programs that they've put together through the podcasting, in effect, capabilities of the technology. So that's a little bit about myself. And again, questions will come, I think, as they occur to you, and we'll continue our discussions. But last night, Wallace, we had a really interesting conversation, and I had the opportunity to learn more about what it was like back in the late 60s at Dartmouth Broadcasting, and the program What's Happening that you did for a while there, and other programs that you were involved with. So I think this would be a great transition to go back in time to the bygone days of Dartmouth Broadcasting in the late 60s, and what it meant for you and for yourself personally, and for the music that you were programming at that time, for the community. So it'd be great to hear some stories about what your experiences have been like.
Well, thank you and good morning. I think we're still good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. Okay, right, okay, fine. That's it. Right, they're just testing 1, 2, 3, right? So, there's a few things I wanted to mention just in our initial conversation. We have obviously we're all panelists here, and would like to have an interactive experience today. So I'll just begin with just some initial comments. And I was thinking as Professor Moody was doing the introduction, I said, well, what would I try to describe in terms of what I was looking to do here at Dartmouth, coming here as a student. Obviously, we're looking to go to school, but what was thinking, and it's taken me all these years to really be able to articulate, well, what would be my own personal, how I would describe my life mission in terms of wherever I go, whatever I was trying to do, and it would be to add value. I'd like to say wherever I was, by the time I concluded doing whatever it was I was doing, that I had added value to that particular situation. Coming here to Dartmouth, I came here, I was 16 years old. I was a pre-med, serious pre-med. I was a biology major. I had been admitted to Johns Hopkins BA MD program and really wanted to be a doctor. My father talked me out of going to Johns Hopkins because he heard me talking about my social plans in Baltimore, which included going to Howard University and Morgan State and a number of other places. And he's probably was right to get me to come to Dartmouth instead. I think if I had stayed in Baltimore, I'd just now be getting out of jail. And, it's be a very different story. But in any event, I came here as pre-med, as a biology major, and that's what I was going to do. I didn't really know about the radio station until I was already admitted in coming here, and I just said, I definitely want to do that. I just want to do that. I hadn't done it anyplace else, but, I loved, in the 50s, 60s growing up, the radio was still a very real part of entertainment and news, and I definitely want to do that. So as soon as I could, I went to sign up, and as soon as they could, the people who were managing the station put me on the Dawn Patrol. And so that was when I first learned the notion of climbing the ladder of opportunity. And so yes, that 5:30 a.m. business is really true. Turning on the transmitter at 6 in the morning, that's very true. Giving the weather reports, there will be a high of 20 below zero today, which is a hell of a way to start your own day, of course. But in any event, during the process, I wound up doing a number of things at the station. I did all of the shows from the Best of Broadway, which was interesting and easy listening. But we had opportunity to do R&B and soul, and all of it I enjoyed because it was just a lot of fun communicating that way, being a part of it. But as that was going on, this is not happening in a vacuum, of course. We had, this is 66, 67, we have the civil rights era really moving into high gear even after the passage of the historic legislation. We've got the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement. We've got, conflicts on campus, and it was very much a part of that. So I was also writing for the school paper. And I was mentioning to one of our colleagues here that I missed the conflict between the paper and the radio station. I just did both. Never occurred to me not to. And so I would, Simon and Garfunkel came on campus. I got an interview with them, and later Sly Stone and whoever came on campus, I would always interview them. And then I'd do other articles as well. more commentary areas because I was also very involved with the Black Student Organization, Dartmouth Afro-American Society, ultimately becoming the head of that organization. And that was, when we were talking about adding value here at Dartmouth, I believe, and still do, that part of adding value to this institution was not to just try to excel academically in a personal sense, but also to change this institution for the better. And part of that change, of course, in my view, included diversity and included recognition of the fact that that this is a multicultural country in which we live, and that this country, this institution could not, I think, in all good conscience, be monochromatic, not just optically, but also culturally in terms of its academic presentation. So that produced a lot of conflict. To say the least, and and as they say, there's without conflict, there's very little change, and so ultimately there was significant change that took place in this school, and all this was happening while we were doing this business on the radio. So to your point, if those of you remember for the radio station at the beginning of every semester, you say, okay, here are the assignments. Who's going to do this show? Who's going to do what show? And in those days, the show would, the station would go off the air at 1 o'clock, which you play the national anthem and they turn off the transmitter. And I did that show for a while. And then I came in I guess January of '69. I said, I want to go on the air at 1 o'clock. And then let's just leave the station on and let me go. And so they said, well, you can't do it. They said, well, there's no law. I said, well, okay. I said, fine. They said, well, how long do you want to go? I said, until I stop. And so depending on the night, we'd go to like 3, to what classes I had the next morning. That was important too. So you go to 2, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, what have you. And we play all kinds of different music. And as I mentioned, I introduced Jimi Hendrix to the campus at the time. For those of you who are jazz aficionados, I will confess that I thought that Jimi Hendrix was actually John Hendrix of Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. It was in a new persona. And so much to my surprise, I said, look at this Jimi Hendrix guy. So, but Roberta Flack and all, we had a good time doing that. But the first show, and then I'll conclude on this point, right, how the show got its name, because I said, okay, be back here like 12:45, 1 o'clock in the morning to do the show. So I went back to my dorm. And, I was just talking with my friends, and about 12:45, so I said, aren't you supposed to be doing a show tonight? I said, oh, geez. So I got my records and was running from Lord Hall over to Robinson. And as I'm coming in the door of the studio, I gave them my theme song. They were playing that. And the disc jockey just before me says, stay tuned. Wallace Ford is coming on the show. It was Wally Ford then. He says, coming on the show. And in a few minutes with his new show, and he turns down the mic as I'm coming in. And he says, Wallace, what's the name of the show? And I didn't hear him say that. I just walked in and said, hey, what's happening? And he said, the What's Happening Show. And so I said, well, that's pretty good. And so that's how I got the name. As I said, as many times it happens, it's just total happenstance. But we'll talk a little bit more, after we in the course of this interaction, just about what happened at the school, because there were some very historic moments. The death of Martin Luther King, for example, happened April 4th, 1968. We were rehearsing a play at the time. We got the news about 7:30 that night and asked to go on the air that night with a statement which ultimately resulted in the entire campus being closed, all classes being canceled that following Monday. He died on a Thursday the following Monday because there was just a need to kind of clear the air, if you will, and try to get a better sense of purpose at the school. And I concluded my career here at the college as a student by actually being a commencement speaker, and had an opportunity to speak to not only my colleagues who were in the class, but of course all of our parents of all of the students that I was in school with, and to the administration. And the one thing we said is that we were looking to be a part of change, and the black students who came to Dartmouth College in 1965, 66, in those early days, were really represented in a very unique way, an expression of the dreams and aspirations and hopes of our parents and grandparents, people who could never even didn't know where Dartmouth was, much less imagine that we could be here. And so we ended that particular presentation at commencement. I said to all our mothers and fathers, your sons are now with you. And we've tried to believe that was the case when we were here at the college. And certainly believe that we did add value in the ways that I expressed. And a large part of that was the platform of WDCR and the radio station, at least for me personally. So it's a pleasure being here today, and I look forward to our further conversation. Thank you.
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I grew up in Southern California where the kind of commuter and driving culture really, I think, elevated radio. I just grew up constantly listening to radio in the car. And so there were the more generic pop and rock stations, which I had a really strong relationship. And then there was also a really small, poor quality Iranian AM radio station, which was this tiny little window into a culture into my own culture that I had very little kind of personal experience with and didn't spend time with. And I think that that window was really important to me and really opened my eyes to a lot of the motivations and the things that people of my culture and Persians think about on a day-to-day basis. And so when I came to Dartmouth and I had the opportunity to be that voice and to express my identity in a way that I had heard people for decades on the radio express theirs, I was just blown away just with this opportunity to reach thousands of people on, a weekly or daily basis. And so I immediately went into DCR, had my weekly show with a few friends in which we talked about whatever we wanted to. And I was really impressed with how open and unstructured of a platform it was that enabled any student to express themselves however they wanted, whether it was kind of with cultural identity or gender identity or sexual identity or just with their hobbies. And of course, one of the best ways to understand the motivations and cultures of people around the world is to kind of hear where they're coming from, hear just their backgrounds. And I was super happy with that opportunity. I went on to be the program director of DCR, really encouraging people to be creative about the shows that they had and to push the boundaries of what they felt comfortable with expressing. I was also really pleased that the directorate managed to shield much of the students from the kind of financial issues that were going on, and with shutting down the AM station and transitioning it fully to an internet station. I appreciated that the commercial pressure did not kind of come down on us to tighten the format and to limit the form of expression that DCR allowed us. I think that my experience with 99 Rock was a little bit different. Of course, I joined 99 Rock about the year after Heath joined the station, so it was still kind of in its rebuilding phase. And so there was a lot of commercial pressure to fit into the boundaries of a standard alternative rock radio station. And so I think that there was a little bit of kind of cultural pigeonholing, especially since it was such a male-dominated space. And from what I understand, that's gotten a lot better, and I'm really glad to hear it. And I know that Heath was a really, really helpful presence in that space. But yeah, so happy to go into that more, but that's kind of the high level. Oh yeah, and sorry, one more thing. My interest in that sort of expression that DCR allowed me has kind of really flowed into my personal current career at Facebook, which is similarly a platform that enables people to express themselves and their identities and reach as many people as they want to, however they can. So I think that my experience in DCR really helped my career currently and helping me prioritize and see the importance in that sort of free expression in the globalized current internet world.
Hi, I'm Madison. I overlapped with Shireen. I'm a 12, so we were on the directorate at the same time and had, close enough, thanks Gina, and had actually I would say sort of opposite experiences. So my freshman year I thought I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, so I came to the radio station and having heard about all of these wonderful things that the Dartmouth Broadcasting News team had done previously with the elections and affiliations, found that there was actually not a news department. So I sort of volunteered as a very green freshman to try to get that program back and running. We started having news whips, which brought a whole bunch of different people into the station. We tried to reach very broadly across campus to get a lot of different perspectives and people involved. And then we also started Voices of the Valley, which I think Tim mentioned earlier. And that was our public affairs sort of show where we would try to bring in different people from campus. So When I was doing the news, I also joined the 5:30 a.m. train, and we were running 24 hours, so I didn't have that flipping the switch moment, but I did have the walking across the green at 20 below moment, and started doing news for Chris Garrett in the morning, every hour live. And while I was there, we kind of said, oh, well, why don't you just co-host the show, because you're here and it would be good to have, another voice. So I co-hosted the morning show live with Chris Garrett for a period and ultimately became director and general manager of Dartmouth Broadcasting. And I think actually a lot of the themes that Shireen was chatting about, I saw the other side of. So when I was GM, the financial issues were quite rough. I was there when George had to help us shut down the AM station. And there was a lot of pressure with WFRD to be really commercial. And I think there's a lot of talk with current Dartmouth students and recent Dartmouth students that there's this kind of bubble around Dartmouth, and that Dartmouth occupies this space in the Upper Valley that is very different from its surroundings, and I think that that has kind of escalated over time. It's very different politically, it's very different socially, and so that puts 99 Rock in a very interesting position, because you've got this group of students who are a part of the Dartmouth bubble, and they're trying to reach out beyond the bubble. So as we're trying to do that and boost our ratings and be attractive to advertisers because we have no revenue, there was a lot of pressure to be very Upper Valley focused. And so as Shireen also kind of mentioned, there's this sort of male-dominated aesthetic that we were going for, and I think that's partially the format and partially who we were trying to appeal to. Our listener base was very heavily male. And so being a woman kind of co-hosting the morning show, I think, was an interesting experience, because I was exposed to a lot of perspectives that were maybe a little bit different than mine. But I would echo the fact that the station as a whole and the leadership was really supportive of kind of trying to make it an inclusive place. And I think having a sophomore female be your general manager was really a testament to that. So the radio station also helped me decide that I did not want to do news for the rest of my life, but that I did really, really enjoy business, which is what I kind of saw as the GM trying to help us get out of debt. And I now do strategy consulting and have actually worked with some radio clients, which has been very interesting. I was advising the CEO of one of the nation's biggest radio conglomerates on some strategic stuff. And it happened to come up that I had a radio show when I was in college, which was one of the most mortifying experiences on this project, because you've got this guy who owns a jillion radio stations saying, oh, tell me about your college radio show. And I was like, oh, face in hand, this is so embarrassing. I can't even remember what we played. But I do think that the station really helped prepare me for my career and helped me figure out what I was excited about and what I wanted to do. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. Laughing at me, Kevin. So anyway, I guess I'll start with how I joined Dartmouth Broadcasting, which I always think is a very interesting story, because when I joined Dartmouth Broadcasting, Catherine McNaughton was in charge of the business team where, they did sales, they also had a legal representative, and me, an aspiring lawyer at the time, was like, cool, legal representative, we have a radio station, and I don't have to go on air ever. I could just do the business side of it. Well, the funny thing is, it was when I got there, I never did one thing related to that. I got there and went to the meeting, and then about a week later, I came back and spoke to Heath, and he was telling me all about the programming. He found out that I was really into this band that we used to play a lot called Shinedown. And after that moment, they were like, you should be on the programming team. So I didn't do one thing of business. And then my first thing I did was I went to this remote broadcasting event down at Home Depot. Every year, I think we still do this. Maybe not, I don't know. With the Bear Ridge Speedway, they do this like car show at Home Depot. And so I went to that, and that was the first thing I ever did with the radio station. And then immediately after that, I did a commercial spot. And then my sophomore summer, which was the term immediately following that, they said, hey, Jeanette, we saw you were interested in programming. How would you like to be the program director this term? We'll train you to get you on air. And once I got there and was trained to be on air, they were like, okay, cool. you seem to have the basics down. How about we throw you on from 1 to 4 today? It's going to air in about 3 hours, so, good luck with that. Have some fun. And I'm pretty sure, I don't really remember what I talked about in between the songs and during those spots, but I can promise you that it was probably awful. I got a lot better as time went on, but it was absolutely awful. So just that first time and me being new to it. And, I really did enjoy my time at Dartmouth Broadcasting, and it was a place where I always felt included. I grew up in a military family, and my dad was active duty the entire time I was in school, which means, for some of you guys who aren't familiar with, military families, I moved every 3 years. So I'm always someone who's out there searching for a community that I can join. And because I move so much, I often do, when I am the newcomer, feel excluded in places. And I felt like at Dartmouth Broadcasting, as soon as I got there, I felt as though there was a place for me. They were trying to find things for me to do when I got there. And Dartmouth Broadcasting is an interesting place because we don't just have one thing, as my fellow panelists have already, articulated. There's, the news department, which was still there when I was there as well, and I believe still going strong. There's Web DCR, where you're able to do, you're able to go on air and do your own show and play your own music and talk about whatever you want. You can go on there and find a book of recipes if you really want to and sit there and read it if that's really what you want to do. I'm not sure anyone would listen to it, but I'm pretty sure you could do that if you wanted to. And that's like a great platform for students to have here and continues to be a great platform that students have here. And then where I spent most of my time, which was on air, even though I came in not wanting to be on air, was the FM station, WFRD, where you really are learning the business of radio, and you're learning how to compete with, competing, these stations out here run by professionals, and you are having to compete with them. You are having to sell ads. You are having to make money, and you are also having to, go on air and have a personality for yourself. And I can kind of see the progression of where it went from, I guess, trying to cater to the male demographic that listened to 99 Rock and also continues to listen to 99 Rock. But while I was there and when I was training people, one thing I always told them was, be yourself. I used to listen to Heath and Chris Garrett's morning show all the time when I was there, just trying to get some tips on what I could tell the students as they were trying to improve their shows. And one of those things were to just be yourself, and you'll be able to craft your own personality that way. And that just reminds me of Bridget Kate, who's sitting right over there. She's a 16. When she came to the radio station, it was her sophomore year. And she sent me an email, her and her friend Mary Lynn Sitko, which I wish I still have. It's the best email anyone has ever sent me. And she went on this long, basically an essay, I'm pretty sure it was a 5-paragraph essay, about how she wanted to return rock and roll sensibility to the campus and educate students about, old rock and roll. And she signed it the Sensibility Twins, Bridget Kate and Mary Lynn. And it was such a great email. It was really long. And so they came and they just had a great dynamic together. And, I think after you were there, I don't think we ever had many, duo shows. But, I saw their dynamic together and I talked to Heath. I was like, is it possible for us to get both of them on at the same time and do a show together? And so we talked about it and we were like, it works better in the morning, so let's throw them on right before Chris Garrett's show, because we had, been noticing that more people were listening in that early, because you have a lot of truck drivers here and people who are working the night shift and coming home around 4 o'clock. So we threw them on about 4 a.m., which sounds like a horrible shift. I mean, it's 4 a.m. in the morning. But they absolutely, I know they loved it, and they just brought their own personality to it. And it was just these two women coming on before Chris Garrett and, just talking about Alex Turner and how much she loved him and in his leather pants and the music and talking in between the segues. And we got a really good response from it. I used to get emails from listeners saying, yeah, who are those two girls on? They're really great. Can we keep them on all the time? They're wonderful. And I think one day they couldn't do their show, so we had someone cover for them. And they were like, where did those girls go? We like them. Bring them back. Bring back I think they called it Jackie and the Duchess and the pre-morning show. Bring them back. And so that was just one way that I felt that, Dartmouth Broadcasting was really inclusive, even, in the commercial side where you don't always have a lot of say in what gets played because, we do stick to a strict format because that's kind of how radio is run now. You stick to that strict format. And when part of the time while I was there, it was alternative rock, but while I was there, we, decided to change it to active rock, but you're still able to be yourself on air. Of course, there are some minor limitations. You cannot curse on air. Yeah, you can't do that. And you could not bad talk the station while you were on air. I don't know why anyone would do that, but I was just like, don't talk bad about the station while you're on air. That's like, you just shouldn't do that. But other than that, just be yourself. If you're a funny person, tell jokes. If you're not a funny person, don't try to be a funny person and tell jokes. Just do what you're interested in. And then, yeah. So then another avenue which I saw which made me feel like Dartmouth Broadcasting was a really inclusive space was, one, we did a lot of remote broadcasting events while I was there. Like I said, I started out going to a remote broadcasting event, and I always encourage, other students to, hey, go to this thing. I know it's Saturday and you have to be there at 9 a.m., but go. Like, you're going to learn a lot, not just about, your fellow disc jockeys, but you're also going to learn a lot about the Upper Valley community, which in and of itself has its own culture too. And Dartmouth Broadcasting is in this unique position, and 99 Rock is in this unique position where, we deal with the Upper Valley community on a day-to-day basis. So I thought that was pretty cool. And I guess I'll wrap this up by kind of talking about the community at 99 Rock and Dartmouth Broadcasting as a whole. As any of the students who are 16s and 17s here will tell you, I was there literally all the time. Literally all the time. I was always there. And it was because I felt so comfortable in the station, especially after the renovations. They look really nice if you haven't been there yet. So I was there all the time watching TV. Normally, I would watch America's Next Top Model. I would watch reruns of The Tyra Show. And I was not the only one there watching TV and just hanging out. There were a couple of 15s brought some of their friends who were in different departments on the radio station. I think some of the sports people, some of the web DCR people, and then some people who weren't even affiliated with the station would come in and they watched the How I Met Your Mother finale. And I happened to walk through at that time, and I sat in and talked to them and, really got to know them pretty well. And these were people on the station I had never talked to before because, they were in different departments. And then there's also Kevin Patterson right over there. Current GM, and he's 17. When he first came to the station, he would sit every day and watch Jeopardy at 7 or 7:30, because here it comes on both times. And, I had never really watched Jeopardy. In fact, I never watched it. I don't think I'd ever seen one episode before, Kevin was there. And it just so happened that me and my friends would come through, and I would go do my show, and they would, sit around and hang out. And these were friends who weren't a part of the radio station at all either, but they felt comfortable coming there, hanging out, and exploring the different options. And a couple of them went on to do DCR shows because they just really enjoyed being there. Well, eventually, we kind of started what I now call the Jeopardy Club in Dartmouth Broadcasting. And a group of us every day would come in and watch Jeopardy at 7 or 7:30, depending on how our schedules worked. No matter what, we were always there. And even as students were passing by to do their shows or to go on WebDCR, they would stop and they would talk to, even if they didn't know us, they would sit and they would talk to us and they would watch it too. Or if we were watching the iHeartRadio Music Awards, they would sit down and they would watch it with us. And it was a great way to build a community within Dartmouth Broadcasting, one that even as I've come back twice now, both times that I've come back, I've seen that kind of culture is still there at the station. And it's I love being on air and I love all of that, but most importantly, I love the people and I love the community that is there and continues to be there. And all of you here are part of that community. And I think it's such a beautiful thing. Like I said, being a military dependent my entire life, that is something I'm always looking for. And I've found that here. And I think that's very important to be able to have a space on campus where you can always come back to, even though, you don't know I don't know really any of the 19s. I just met them because they weren't here when I was here. But guess what they did when I showed up yesterday? We watched Jeopardy at 7:30, and it was wonderful. So yeah, I'll just end it with that. For me, the radio was always a very inclusive space for me and sharing my cultural, background.
So perhaps some questions have occurred to some of you, or some comments you'd like to make about, just again, the general theme of inclusivity and what Dartmouth Broadcasting means to the people here on the panel, some of the comments, the stories people have been sharing. Yes.
I was interested in the the last time I did this, I was feeding it back, and my wife, who was also a broadcaster, corrected me. I was interested in the observations about Dartmouth Broadcasting as an inclusive space, and maybe the chicken and egg proposition to that, and be interested in the observations of the panelists from different eras. In the late 50s and early 60s, when I was there, I think that Dartmouth Broadcasting was an inclusive space in a very, as you've described, Jeanette, very much so, in terms of being a welcoming and unstructured, free-form opportunity for individuals, a variety of backgrounds and interests and cultural experience, their own cultural experience, and so forth, to come and find a way to do their creative thing and use their imagination and so forth. But the student body, obviously, in the late 50s and 60s, well, for one thing, we had no women working at Dartmouth Broadcasting. And 8 years or so before you, Mr. Ford, the student body, probably the men, I remember a very small fraction of African-American men, and I don't remember by name or identification or observation, Hispanic men were almost non-existent, at least in my kind of informal student observation, and I suspect for most of us. Nowadays, of course, the student body is hugely more diverse and variegated in its composition, and it's wonderful to hear how that is reflected in the Dartmouth Broadcasting experience. But I'd be interested in the observations of you who came in some later generations along the way here in Dartmouth Broadcasting about how, which was the chicken and which is the egg in terms of the diversity of the student body influencing the diversity of Dartmouth Broadcasting, or vice versa.
If I might begin, I think it's pretty clear that the diversity of the student body created whatever inclusionary process that we're speaking about today. I mean, I would be pretty firm in stating that. In large part, I know when we look at like 66, 67, for goodness sake, it is not just Dartmouth radio at that point. I mean, you can go across any aspects of media in this country and just how people were expressing themselves. There were out of, I don't know how many, let's say, close to 3,000 students on campus in 66. There were 60 black students maybe in that, and it wasn't just the number, and I think that's the important point to keep in mind. You know, I can tell you any number of my non-black students, fellow students, so they had never spoken to a black person in their lives, or the only black person they ever spoke to was their maid. Or somebody, somebody in a service capacity that just did not know who we were or how to speak to us. And there's, to look at the other side of it, I grew up in a, fairly slightly diverse setting, in that one of few blacks in a very large white high school, for example. But Dartmouth was not an unfamiliar experience for me. But there are a number of black students who was absolutely a unfamiliar experience to be in this type of setting. So you had that kind of dissonance kind of starting off with, and there was nobody who's going to say to me, no, you can't be on the radio. But then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do there? Well, in the first instance, you do what you're asked to do because you really didn't have some concept of what you might like to do differently. And over a period of time, as you've heard me express, we're doing different kinds of shows and programming, and obviously that has evolved into all of the kinds of things we see having taken place over the last, 30 plus years, 30, 40 years, which is great. But I don't want to well, let me put it in affirmative. I would like to make sure that in my comments, I just really try to convey the sense of tension that there was on campus at this time. It was not an easy process. It was not a smooth process. There were a number of people who were goodwill and who thought that was, the change was good. And there was a number of people who just really had a serious problem with it because, most of us are conservative as human beings, small c. Conservative. And so we don't like change. We like to sleep on this side of the bed. We want to have our breakfast at this time of the day, whatever it might be. And so when you change it, it's a problem. And the kinds of changes we were talking about in terms of that, yes, you can't just have this college go forward and not acknowledge the fact that you have an African-American population here. And of course, that has evolved, and you have a female population here. And you have people from various diverse ethnic and cultural values, and that all has to be included. It's not monochromatic. It's not singular. That tension was being played out throughout the campus all of the time. Whether it's death threats or fights and what have you, it was not always a pretty sight. But then change is rarely a pretty process. I think probably this college has come out on the other side of that as well as most institutions have, but just like the country we live in, we're far from perfect. And so, I think the fact that we're here to talk about inclusion and to talk about diversity and to give some credit and some value to diversity and inclusion is actually a very good thing, because that was not happening. It was not a concept 45, 50 years ago. So I think the people who came to this campus, both in terms of diversity and also their spirit, and in terms of their ideas that the institution had to change for the better, I think was a very good one. President Kemeny, I'll just close on this. President Kemeny, when he became president, was very, very aware of the fact that this school needed to look at all of these things differently and move away from the conflict and find a way that you'll have this institutional change and institutional involvement of everybody who's going to be a part of this Dartmouth community. And that was a very good thing.
Just to follow up, we were on campus for one semester or one trimester together. I entered in September '69. You're '69, so presumably you left in June.
70.
Oh, 70. Okay, so we were there more. And my comment would be that I agree that there was a lot of tension across the campus. In my dorm, we had Nels Armstrong and Wade Smith.
Sure.
On my half of the floor. Very rarely saw one of them, saw the other quite a bit. And at WDCR in the 70 to 72 period, 69 to 72 period, essentially there was the what's happening folks, and they did not interact much with the rest of the station. And it's great to hear that things have gotten much better. And
Yeah, that was a big mistake, by the way. I think that was a big mistake, huge mistake, that more black students did not get more involved, both whether it's at DCR or any of the other institutions. Huge mistake. You can see why I'm no longer president of the Afro-American Society. But it was a big mistake. It really was. It really was.
Well, if nobody else has a question, I have one. This is definitely an issue just campus-wide, nation-wide right now, just the issue of diversity, inclusivity in a lot of different areas. And, it's being talked about a lot, especially with the presidential race and with President Hanlon's Moving Dartmouth Forward plan, with a lot of changes being made. This is a good time to talk about improvements that can still be made and how to continue to move forward and foster an environment of inclusivity and camaraderie between anybody who would like that. So to that extent, for the people who just graduated who are on the panel, for others who've been on campus, who've seen how the environment is on campus, nationwide. What suggestions do you think that you would have to improve inclusivity both at the station and to a greater extent at Dartmouth?
I have a lot of opinions about this. To be 100% honest, I could probably sit here and talk about this for probably 3 hours, and it could just be me lecturing on it. But I won't talk about this for 3 hours. I'll try to keep it short. So I was here during when a lot of the protests really began to amp up. So that was around, I want to say 2012-ish. Yeah, I think I was a junior. Yeah, and we had, the Real Talk protests, and then they did cancel classes for a day. I think you mentioned last night that was one of the 3 times that they did cancel classes. And, that really opened my eyes in a lot of ways to a lot of the realities that people who of various identities, whether it's a racial identity, a sexual identity, a gender identity, feel in general in society and on campus. And I came into Dartmouth with a completely different mindset about these things of, everything is way better now, everything is different now. But when I was here, I took a lot of English and history classes and also interacted with my peers and realized it's not always the case. In some ways, we do repeat our past, and in some ways we do still have those prejudices, but the thing is we have to acknowledge them. And just to address Matt's question, one thing that I think that as a whole at Dartmouth that students could be a bit better at, and by a bit I mean try to do this, that's kind of what I mean by a bit, is we don't often take the time to do things that we feel are not meant for us. So for that, I'll kind of give an example, and Kevin, I am going to kind of we had a conversation yesterday. Yeah, me and Kevin were talking about being the radio enthusiasts that we are. We were talking about podcasts, and Kevin asked me, what's my favorite podcast? And I was like, well, I really like this podcast called The Read with Kid Fury and Crystal, but my other favorite podcast that I think you would like is called For Colored Nerds. It's really, really good. And Kevin was like, well, will I understand it? And I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, you're not the target audience, but I still think you should listen to it, because a lot of the stuff that they talk about, me and you talk about regularly, like, the Mad Men season finale and the symbolism and all of that, or even yesterday we were talking about Beyonce's, latest masterpiece, Lemonade, that dropped last weekend. And, they talk about things like that in depth. But, there was kind of like this fear from him that he would not understand some of the things that they were saying. And there are certain slang words that maybe you won't understand because that's not your culture, but I think that you should not shy away from that. And so I say all this to say, when the African American Society has a party, go to that party. You may think you're going to be the only person in that room that looks like you, but I can guarantee you that most minority students on this campus feel that way on a daily basis. And I certainly did feel that way here on a daily basis. I'm always the minority in the room. I'm a minority in this room. There are what looks like 3 African American people in this room. I may be wrong because I don't know everyone's ethnicity, but that's what it looks like. So I'm a minority in this room. So it's a really good experience to be a minority in some situations, because it really helps you understand how they are feeling on a daily basis. And with that said, take African American studies classes, take Latin American studies classes, like Professor Moody's class. One of the best classes I ever took was with a professor who is no longer here, but it really taught me about, intersectionality and how race intersects with gender and how race intersects with sexuality and things like that. And it's by taking classes like that, you really get an understanding of things that are going on and how people may be feeling. And you will meet other students of those ethnicities who may not feel comfortable going into these places where they're not the majority. They may not feel comfortable doing that the same way you may not feel comfortable going to a place where you are not the majority. They feel that way too. But the only way to bridge that gap is to bridge that gap. You have to do it. You have to be brave and do that. And I guess I'll kind of end it there.
This is taking it in a slightly different direction, but as we've kind of talked about, maybe the previous iteration of FRD and the current version of DCR have these open formats, right, that are great for letting anyone who wants to say anything do it. The problem with that is they're just kind of shouting into the void, right? The audience, I don't know what your metrics are recently, but I suspect the audience for DCR is not huge, right? So I think while you can kind of take credit and say, great, we're being inclusive, we're checking that box, the bigger struggle, I think, is on the FRD side. And it's a problem that almost every media organization, at least in this country, but probably internationally, faces. It's kind of this tricky balance of both using your microphone and keeping your microphone, right? So you need to be able to keep your audience numbers high. You need to be able to keep attention, but you also, hopefully, want to be able to say something that means something and not just pander to your audience. It's particularly true in news if we look at kind of Fox versus CNN versus NBC, or MSNBC, but I think it's true on the FRD side too. Kind of in the way we were speaking about, okay, you have your kind of target audience and you need to keep being attractive and keeping your ratings high and selling ads to stay alive and keep that microphone. But you also, I think, need to put some effort into delicately saying things that matter.
I guess I'd add too, just, from, and Jeanette alluded to this, from the professor's standpoint, right, this course that I teach, the Latino Studies class, LATS 41, in that class, usually, it is a class that is attractive to Latino students, right? It's an opportunity for them to learn about their own history, right? Something some of them might be very familiar with, sometimes they're not so familiar with. So generally in that class, I have a mixture of students, maybe half or so are Latino, but then there are other students who are taking the class who are African American or Asian American or Anglo American, right? They have all sorts of different backgrounds. And I think courses like that are offered here, women's and gender sexuality studies here, and other interdisciplinary programs provide students with an opportunity to share perspectives, right, where they might not otherwise encounter one another. So from a teaching standpoint, I think the course that I teach is an opportunity for young people to interact with one another, to learn about the stories that they might not be so familiar with, about disenfranchised groups that haven't necessarily had historically, politically access to getting their stories out there. And then, as I've said earlier, right, describing this opportunity within the class to share, musical tastes, to share the microphone, right, in these the X hour that we have, which is very limited time. The students are randomly put together in groups, and they have an opportunity to get to know one another. And for those of you who've been involved in radio, I guess pretty much everyone in this room, it's an opportunity for great social interactions, to have conversations either on mic or off mic about issues that matter to the people who are involved. So I think, I'd love to see, WebDCR become a more relevant forum for students to share ideas. I think that, excuse me, that potential is there. And I think, this is something that we could all think about and moving forward to allow students to understand that this is an opportunity to get their voices out there, to share their musical tastes with one another. And because the medium has changed, right, the podcast format is something that could perhaps become more relevant for students here, and that, the programs that students put together aren't just going out into the void, that there's a way of making other people aware that, they can download it, or that it might be available through the webcasting capabilities. It might be something they could connect to a little more regularly. So I think, they're great opportunities, Matt. I think there's some, ways that we can use this resource that we have here to let people hear one another more, to share perspectives more. And again, as a radio practitioner myself over the years, I see it as a great medium still. I think, things have shifted, but I believe firmly that radio is still very relevant. And that's one of the goals of the class that I teach, is that I try to instill that in students, right? That, after they finish here, even if they haven't tuned in too much to broadcast radio, that as they go into their lives beyond Dartmouth College, that they should be very cognizant of the fact that it is still a very relevant medium. For example, right, currently in the class we're talking about Spanish language media, and it really has made a difference in our society for people of that heritage, right, who might speak Spanish as their first language or second language, to have this sense of community through a form of mass media that still resonates for a lot of people.
Well, the one thing I would say is that, when a student goes to one of your class, enrolls in one of your class, there's a certain self-selection. And my concern would be the larger body politic, if you will, people who don't see the interest or don't have the interest, don't see the need to expand that. And it goes to your point about when you're looking at this broadcast, whatever the programming might be, if people don't listen to it, you really pretty much, as you, I think was the expression, you shouting into the void or yelling into a hole in the ground, right? I mean, it's just, and so but I do think you have to kind of keep that message going. You have to keep that message out there somehow, because it's change, while it's difficult, and it's also incremental. It's rarely that people just wake up one morning and have a very different point of view. But I think these messages have to continually be put out there, and if there's a way sometimes you have to kind of make people eat their spinach. I mean, you have to kind of find a way that they will, and sometimes it's incorporating some of the messages or some of the themes in your class into other curricula. Because it's, well, I don't want to do a Latin studies class, but if I'm looking at, just world cultures, for example, it's got to be in there someplace in a serious fashion. So I think, that may be one of the thoughts out of this. But I do think back to our theme, our regularly scheduled program already in progress, right? I think the radio does play, particularly because students can control it, and students have direct access to it, and you don't have to go through a lot of climb too many rungs on the ladder before you have some real influence which is a very powerful tool. That there is potential to use it, and messages. I guess I would say this: that messages don't have to be, in big block letters, so that everyone understands what you're trying to say. It can be in some of the lyrics of music. It can be in themes of various dramatic presentations. It can be in a number of formats. But as long as I can get you to listen to it, maybe something will resonate over a period of time. So I think, I came here today, and I was very glad to get the invitation, in part because I thought that the experience, in my own experience being involved at Dartmouth over those 4 years and with the radio station was important in terms of personal growth. And I would, with no hesitation, believe that it also had the work that we did on the station had something to do with that era of change that took place on this campus. I have no question about that. And so having a chance to talk about that and seeing where this institution called Dartmouth Radio goes prospectively is something that obviously I embrace the opportunity to have a conversation about it. And again, I want to congratulate you and all the people who were involved with organizing this, because it is I think it's a very good and important thing that's being done here today. We play the national anthem.
Just be careful with your historical facts, which I got from you in the first place, anyway. There was a real effort in the 90s from students of the 90s that I talked to toward mentoring at the station, particularly for the women at the station. There had obviously been women involved in the station. I think some of them were here this morning earlier than that. But the 90s was, and the first female general manager was 1985, but in the 90s, a lot of women rose. There were 5 general managers and many of the other positions. And mentoring was raised as a way to make this acceptance into an organization which might be populated by people different from yourself, whether it's hard rock music that tends to be male, or whether it's ethnic. To have someone, especially as a freshman or a sophomore, to kind of help them and be somebody to relate to. So I'd be interested from each of you whether, A, you had a mentor or somebody you considered a mentor in the station when you started that helped you in that way. And secondly, whether you think that's something that could be more formalized or should be more formalized, or is it even necessary?
I guess I'll start. The short answer is no. I personally did not have a mentor figure when I joined, and I think a lot of that may have been because the radio was, again, rebuilding at the time from somewhat broken, old, stale pieces. But in my time there, I think the mentoring kind of informally did come back. A lot of the management shifted to be or the directorate positions shifted to be a little bit more supportive and accepting. And I think that that is a very valuable figure to have in the radio community. I would highly encourage a more formalized mentoring system to return to the radio. Again, when I joined, I think a lot of the people in charge, quote unquote, were very strong male figures, and so I struggled a little bit with finding a space that I felt super comfortable in, and so I just kind of created that space for myself in my little isolated DCR show. And then in my time as program director, I tried to act a little bit informally as a mentor, but I think that mentors that a person relates with is very, very extremely valuable in helping a person feel accepted and giving them the freedom to open up and be who they feel like they want to be.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate, and that it would be very helpful to have more of a formal mentorship program. One of the changes that we haven't really talked about today, or turning points in the organization, was really when we brought in professionals for the first time. So having Chris Garrett and Heath Cole, and for a while Julie Kay, really I think did change the dynamic of the station. And I think to a certain extent, having those figures around made the student accountability diminish a little bit. So I think, at least during Shireen and my time there, there was a lack of investment, I think, in the future generations within the directorate. And I do think that got a lot better. And it sounds like it's much stronger now, which is very good to hear. But not only did I sort of often feel like there wasn't anyone like me that was kind of came before, but also there was not a lot of interest from former GMs even necessarily to kind of like reach out a hand and say, how can I help you? And I think that is kind of, seems to be like a historical stalwart of this organization, and I think that maybe we fumbled a little bit, but it sounds like we've kind of gotten back on track there.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think I'll echo what they said, and I think a formal mentorship program within Dartmouth Broadcasting would be a phenomenal idea. I think it would really appeal to freshmen and sophomores as they're coming in and trying to find their place on campus, and also in Dartmouth Broadcasting. I think that's a wonderful idea. When I joined Dartmouth Broadcasting, like I kind of joined in, like I said earlier, in an interesting way, and became program director my sophomore summer, and then was asked to continue as program director my junior year and then my senior year. My senior year, I actually applied and became program director, but I was asked to do it my junior year. So from when, basically my entire time on air, I was always that person who was in power. So at that point, I kind of became a mentor to the students who were there. So I didn't have a student mentor myself. There were people on the directorate, Chris Zhao, who's a 13, who did help me out, as well as Shane O'Neill, who was a 14 like me, who also helped me out and gave me advice because they'd been at the station longer. But in terms of really good mentorship and really good advising, Heath Cole and Chris Garrett are phenomenal. I learned a lot just from working with them, and not just about working in radio, but also about being professional and being in an environment and taking responsibility and taking initiative and being held accountable for not just my actions, but the actions of people on my staff. Because when they missed their show, I yelled at them, but then I got a talking to too, because, I was right there in the middle, and that, reflects badly on us. So I learned a lot about that, and they really, really coached me on how I should be training them, and things that they thought that I could do better. And also, if I had a problem and I didn't know how to deal with it, I knew that I could go to them, or I could go to Chris, or I could go to Shane, or anyone else on the directorate. And as I moved forward and began to train my own staff, so the 16s and the 17s as well, and some of the 15s, I tried to be that mentor figure to them, the mentor figure that I didn't have like a set person to go to, so that if they have questions, even though I'm not here anymore, if they continue to have questions, I'm always like, hey, you can always call and email me or text me, and I'll respond to you. I'll help you out. Just let me know if you have any issues or any problems. But I do think a formal mentorship program would be really helpful as well, and I think that would only increase inclusivity at the station.
Yeah, I would, speaking from there was no mentorship process that I'm aware of when, it's kind of like probably sink or swim might be a good term, although very few people sank. Some people swam better than others, and that was, I think, pretty much the way it went. listening to this, I think probably a mentorship process would have been helpful on some level, particularly not so, the point that Jeanette was mentioning, I think is a good one, about professionalism. Because we kind of learned that from the seniors and juniors, and they, of course, kind of figured it out on their own, and it was kind of handed down. So you kind of had a hand-me-down kind of mentorship process. But for some consistent notion of what professionalism is about, I think we all wind up learning that from our various work experiences, and that could have been better, I think, at the radio station. I'm glad to hear that there is that professional presence now, because that's an important part. We've talked about that from the very beginning this morning, about a number of people who have been at the radio station, in the radio, Dartmouth Radio, and didn't necessarily become broadcast people, but it still is a very useful experience. And so I think the notion of instilling and inculcating some notion of professionalism and demonstrating what that is, I think could be extremely helpful. Probably more so than the creative part about how I, work on the behind a microphone as opposed to somebody else. The former, I think, is much more important than the latter.
Yeah, and as someone who's currently at the station, I can attest to the fact that it has gotten a little bit better. I mean, when I came in, this was my first year, so I can say that my mentors really for this year was Gina Campanelli, who is the program director of WFRD. She's currently in Italy, but she made a video for us. You'll see her say hi later. And Kevin Patterson, the current GM. And both of them are really, really passionate about the station and are very good at teaching us about professionalism and how to work with the station, how to be someone who provides a good product on air, and really a lot of what's important about the station and mentors and stuff like that is because when you're on the radio, you're talking to people, and the way Gina put it to me was, a lot of people have this preconceived notion about what radio is when they come in, and that's a lot of times what they put on their show, and that's not really what makes a good radio show. You're talking to people, it's people in the Upper Valley, people all around who are listening to this show, and you're just trying to relate to them and just have a conversation about things that you both love. And I know that I wouldn't have known instinctively that that's how you're supposed to approach this without Gina, without Kevin as mentors. So and of course Heath and Chris are both really great mentors as well, because they're both so helpful and inclusive and inspiring, and they really try and incorporate everybody into the family. And they also know the business like the back of their hands. But I agree completely that a formal mentorship program would definitely benefit the station because a few years ago, I know Gina had, because of when Gina, the person who was sort of my mentor, when she came into the station, she didn't really have a mentor except for Chris and Heath, who were good, but there was no student mentor. And so a lot of the time it'll depend on who's the directorate year by year if there's not a formal program. So I think a formal program so that everybody could have my experience where I had a mentor who loved the station and who could teach me how to be a proper broadcaster on the radio and how to become a part of the radio and Dartmouth Broadcasting family. I think a formal mentorship program would be great. So, Kevin, take notes.
Hi, I'm Kevin Allen. I'm an O2. My experience was a little bit different, I think, because I definitely had a student mentor while I was there. Like some other people, I kind of got sucked into it, and it kind of took off from there. But I am a TV news producer now, and I don't think I would be if it weren't for my experience at Dartmouth Broadcasting. So without hijacking the conversation, I think that yes, mentoring is good, and I think students now and recent graduates will relate to the idea that students have an easier time listening to students. So I think it's better if you have that process that knowledge handed down. And to bring it back to like the inclusivity point, I think that that's where the mentorship can really shine. I think that Mr. Ford said that people are by nature conservative. I think that we had somebody else hint at it's easy to kind of self-segregate. And I think Madison brought up this concept of shouting into the void, right? So I think it's very easy when you have a microphone to be able to just kind of like get caught up in your own thing and say, this is the message that I'm trying to get across, and it doesn't matter if I'm shouting into the void. What a mentor can do is take a step back. They can, not lose the forest for the trees, and they can take a step back and say, okay, this is, what you're trying to get out there, and this is how you make it more inclusive so that you're not just shouting into that void.
I think I'd second the statement that in the 69 to 72 period when I was there was a big element of sink or swim. My experience was I walked through the door and I was welcomed and put to work. But at the same time, one of my classmates, who I never really knew, named Bob Keeshan, who was the son of Captain Kangaroo, left and never came back because he was told he failed the voice test and he wanted to work on air. And I think that was some of a misguided view of what professionalism in radio was. If you're on the air, you need that deep voice. And if you compare the way the media was in 1970, there weren't blacks and women and others from different backgrounds on national or local media in the mainstream. And that has completely changed today too. So we make progress, but there's still lots of room to move on.
Thanks. Excuse me, thanks. Let me ask first, is it okay to change the subject some? Thank you. I have one observation and one comment. The observation is I was on campus as an undergraduate, 62 to 66, and then 2 years down the street at Tuck and Thayer. In those days, it's probably fair to say there wasn't enough diversity on campus for inclusivity to mean anything, except among vastly predominantly white Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. Today, well, in the gap between Wallace's graduation and the matriculation of the rest of the panel, it appears that an awful lot of good has happened on campus, and it sounds as though a lot of good has happened on the radio station. I'd like to ask you, did the inclusivity that you found on the radio station and the diversity that you found on the radio station help prepare you to deal personally, on the receiving end of what the working world faced you with? And did it prepare you to do anything about that, to try to change it? And I think, particularly Shireen, there's been a lot in the news recently about women in high tech, but I don't mean to just limit it to you at all.
No, that's great. That's a great question. I am going to flip that around a little bit and actually say that I think that the lack of diversity prepared me a lot better than the diversity did. Growing up in Southern California, I actually faced a lot more diversity in my childhood than I did when I came to Dartmouth. Even when I came to Dartmouth, there were a lot more white males than I was used to growing up with, and especially in radio. As I mentioned, most of the directorate, most of the people in charge were white males. It was a very masculine environment and a very male-dominated environment, and I think that definitely opened my eyes to a lot of the issues that I would be facing later in life as a woman in tech, and kind of primed me to better understand how to push back against it, and to recognize kind of the issues involved there.
I would say something pretty similar. So when I was GM, I was the youngest, and Shireen and I were the only women on the directorate. And I think there was maybe one woman on the board of overseers. So yeah, that lack of inclusion and diversity, I think, was really indicative of my future professional things. And it also taught me that as much as we would like to change kind of that situation, it's not changing today or tomorrow. So there are a fair number of things that we kind of given our position can do individually to help mitigate some of those challenges. So for instance, on the radio, I learned that it was going to be really important for me to build credibility with my team really fast. And it was going to be important for me to find common ground. So when I walk into a meeting and everyone's chatting about last night's football game, I'm not immediately left out. I actually love football, but that's a very common example. So I think, yeah, it was challenging at that point, but my job now is an awful lot like that. I also work in tech and consulting, both of which are super male-heavy fields, and it's a very frequent occurrence that I'll be working on a due diligence on a tech company and be in the management meeting and literally be the only woman in a room of 50 men. So yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate that it's like that, and I suspect everyone in this room would love to help accelerate that change, both in terms of women and also in terms of increased minorities in some of these, because all of the studies show that the more diverse your group is, the better the decisions actually are. So yeah, but while we're fighting that battle, I think that the radio really did help prepare me to cope.
So I had a bit of a different experience than the two of them with the radio, because while I was there, I was obviously a woman on the directorate and an African-American woman on the directorate at that, the only African-American woman on the directorate, but there were other minority women on the directorate at the same time as me. They also were really into sports too, so they often, with the guys, would talk about sports. I would come in and ESPN would be on, and I don't really know much about sports, so also that the common ground approach. But with me, as I mentioned earlier, I moved around a lot, so that was kind of an approach that I have been using my entire life, is finding like a common ground approach. And something that I was also in a sorority while I was here helped me a lot during Rush, is the common ground approach when you're trying to find things to talk to girls about. What kind of music you like is a really good question, by the way, because it normally leads to a lot of topics. But for me, what I think helped me the most, because like I said, never really felt excluded at Dartmouth Broadcasting. Even when they were talking about sports, I don't understand sports, but obviously some of the girls there did, so they would talk about it, and I would listen. It was interesting, I guess. It's sports. But I never felt excluded from that. But the things that I did face, sometimes on campus, but not as often as, when we would go on remotes to the Upper Valley with dealing with listeners who, one, hear me on the radio and don't think I'm African-American, so they're surprised when they see me and I am African-American, or they just have different questions because, they have questions just about, stereotypes and things like that I wasn't expecting when I went on to remotes, but because they don't interact with that many minorities, these were just questions that, just came up a lot, like questions about hair, questions about do you like rap, and things like that. And I would say that prepared me more for the workplace than anything else, because those were the questions I got when I started my first job, my second job out of college, when I started working in education policy, and I was one of the only African-American women there. And those were a lot of the questions I got from people that actually worked there. And I was able to deal with those questions without getting angry or annoyed about them, especially as you can see, I wear my hair naturally. So I get a lot of questions about that. A lot of people come up and want to touch it, and no, that's not okay unless you ask. And so I get that a lot, and it gets really frustrating. But Dartmouth Broadcasting helped me deal with that by, putting me in a position to interact with people who often don't talk to African American people and don't understand why my hair curls like this. So.
I have a slightly, not slightly, a different approach in that just those, life circumstances such that from K through 12, I was always one of, there's very few black students in whatever class I was in and whatever school I was in. And so at a very early age, really from the beginning, my parents really prepared me for the adversity that comes with that particular scenario. It's unfortunate that it's still the case, but it's it's not always a very welcoming world we have in these United States, certainly in these United States. But it never, it was all, that was never going to be an excuse. That was never going to be a reason not to try to succeed. And in fact, my expectation, I was taught the expectation was that you're going to succeed. And that runs into problems because then people think, gosh, I was like 12 or 13 and the guidance counselor says, you're doing well as a student, but your teachers complain you act like you own the classroom, and it's like, well, that's why the way these white kids are acting the same way. So, but there's a difference of it. So it never occurred to me to try to behave any differently. And so coming to Dartmouth College, whatever those conflicts we talked about earlier. We're just a part of the process. My experience at the station actually was quite collegial by and large. I'm still friends with a couple of the people that we all worked together, 45, 50 years ago, and so I actually had very little conflict there. I would like to add just one last, because I know we're about to wrap up, but a story which I hope you would find to be interesting about that. I talked about that What's Happening show, and we did not have the benefit of any type of metrics in terms of formal metrics of what kind of listenership we have or ratings and what have you. And so when you're doing a show like the one I talked about starting at 1 a.m. in Hanover, New Hampshire on a winter night, you're wondering like at about 2:30, they're shouting in the whole business, right? Is there anybody out there? And so, I'm having a good time doing this. But so one night, it was about 1:32, and I said, I don't believe anybody's listening. It's like 20 below zero. I don't believe anybody's listening to the show. If we don't get 20 calls in the next 30 minutes, we're going off the air forever. And that was my idea of polling, right? And trying to find out what's going on. And the phones blew up. I mean, it was just like blew up. And it was like, so you had the firemen calling from the firehouses and these housewives, and I don't know what their story was. And then we had students in different states of consciousness is the best way I could put it. It's like, please, man, don't go off the air, man. Please don't, and it's like, hey, fine. So that's how we found out that we still had listeners. So that was our informal way of doing our rating system back in the day. So that was our last little story for the day. But okay.
So I think we will close. I think it's a great spot to finish up. And we are at that time. So obviously conversations can continue after our panel has concluded. So thanks for listening. Thanks for participating.